Hello. Good evening, everyone. Hi, if I haven't had the pleasure of meeting you, my name is Moira Anderson, and I'm the Director of Public Programs here at Crystal Bridges Museum. And it is such a pleasure to welcome you out tonight for the opening of Diego Rivera's America. How many of you have had the chance to go and see the exhibition? Fantastic. Well, everybody else, of course, I know right after this talk or throughout the weekend, you cannot miss it. It's absolutely gorgeous. I want to begin tonight the program with our Indigenous Peoples Acknowledgement. I want to recognize Crystal Bridges' role as settlers and guests in the Northwest Arkansas region. We acknowledge the Caddo, Quapaw, and Osage, as well as the many Indigenous caretakers of this land and water. We appreciate the enduring influence of the vibrant, diverse, and contemporary cultures of Indigenous peoples. We are conscious of the role in colonization that museums have played. As cultural institutions, we have a responsibility to engage in the dismantling of historical and systemic invisibility of Indigenous peoples past, present, and future. We choose to intentionally hold ourselves accountable to appropriate conversation, representation, connection, and education to facilitate a space of measurable change. The evening's lecture tonight marks the first program in a full schedule of engagements that are all centered on the Diego Rivera exhibition. So over the next spring and into the summer season, you're gonna see studio classes, gallery talks, family days, concerts. You're gonna find all of this information, of course, online for some incredible programs that I want everybody to go and mark their calendars to attend after. Trust me, you don't wanna miss a single one. But if I had to highlight just one program, I want everybody to be invited and come back next weekend for a large celebration called Pintura Fest. So next weekend, we are opening up the museum and inviting local painters to come and do live painting here in the Great Hall. So you'll see it arranged in a little bit different sense. There's music, there's food, there's fun for every single age. So everyone come, bring your families. This is gonna be a really fun party to kick off the rest of the exhibition. Tonight, I wanna thank our generous exhibition sponsors, Goldman Sachs, Christie's, Coca-Cola, Avocados from Peru, Shelby and Frederick Gaines, Blakeman's Fine Jewelry, Esther Silver Parker, Halpern Foundation, Jim and Susan Von Gremp, and Cardinal 4 Foundation. And thank you to Mailco for their ongoing support of our lecture programming. Please join me in thanking our generous sponsors tonight. So tonight, to orient us to the Diego Rivera exhibition, we have the absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. James Oles and Dr. Jen Padgett in conversation. That's going to give you the perfect close look at this exquisite exhibition that was developed by the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, Diego Rivera's America, of course. So I'd like to introduce the speakers for this evening. Dr. James Oles specializes in the history of modern Mexican art with broad interests ranging from muralism to photography. His books include South of the Border, Mexico and the American Imagination, which accompanying a traveling exhibition of the same name organized at the Yale Art Gallery, and Art and Architecture in Mexico, the first survey of its kind in some 50 years. His most recent project is Diego Rivera's America, which is also accompanied by a fully illustrated scholarly catalog, which you can purchase in the museum store, and it is wonderful. Oles received his doctorate from Yale University, and he divides his time between the US and Mexico. He teaches in the art department at Wellesley College, and in 2002 was appointed adjunct curator of Latin American art at the Davis Museum, where he advises on exhibitions and acquisitions for the permanent collection. In 2019, he curated Art Latin America against the survey, which featured 150 works by 100 Latin American and Latinx artists in the Davis Museum collection. As a guest curator, he has organized numerous other exhibitions in Mexico and the US. Joining him in conversation is our very own Dr. Jen Padgett. Jen serves as the Crystal Bridges Acting Windgate Curator of Craft and the venue curator for Diego Rivera's America here at the museum. In addition to advancing craft across the museum's collection, she specializes in modern art from the 1900s to 1950s. She joined the curatorial team at Crystal Bridges in 2017. Padgett has organized reinstallations of the museum's modern art galleries and several exhibitions, including Crafting America, which she co-curated with Glenn Adamson, and Seeing One Another, New Views on the Alfred Stieglitz Collection, a focus show that is currently on view in the Crystal Bridges permanent collection galleries. So you be the judge, go see both, and report back. Padgett received her MA and her PhD in art history and archaeology from Washington University in St. Louis and has held various positions and fellowships at a variety of museums, including the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Amon Carter of American Art. Please join me in welcoming our speakers this evening.
Thank you so much, Moira, for the introduction, and thank you so much for everyone who has come to join us tonight. This has been an exhibition long in the making, and having this opportunity to be in the galleries with people, to see their responses to these fantastic works of art is the most rewarding part of being a curator. To be able to look at these closely, to have the sense of revelation and discovery, this is what we do it all for. So, although we're not physically in the galleries, having the opportunity to share with you all in this setting is the other part that's just so exciting. So, in this talk, it's going to be conversational, and we'll have the opportunity to dive into the stories of just a few of the works of art in the show. Because each one of these pictures has a story that you could go on for a whole hour about one. But we're going to keep it short and sweet, but talk about some of the highlights and especially some of the behind the scenes. What are the things that we can share about the process behind putting together the exhibition that will add to your experience of the show? So, Jay, I thought we could start at the beginning, and you could tell us a little bit about how this show came to be, and especially how the kind of framework or scope of the show is determined.
Thank you, Jen, and for a great partnership, and thank you to everyone here, particularly the funders and everything. But Jen's right. I could talk an hour about each and every one of the paintings in the show, and I'm going to have to be as succinct as I can be. My friends here know I'm not the most succinct person. But in 2016, I gave a tour in Mexico to the upper-level patrons of SF MoMA, and after that tour, the director, Neil Benezra, invited me to develop a project on Rivera for the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. And I didn't want to do a full retrospective that covered his 50-year-long career, which would open with his student days in the early 20th century and close in the depths of the Cold War, but rather to focus on a tighter 25 or so year period that began with Rivera's return to Mexico in 1921 after over a decade spent in Europe. Some of you know he was a leading Cubist in the mid-teens in Paris. There's a great Cubist, Rivera, in the Fisk collection that's shared here with Crystal Bridges on display right now. So I wanted to open with this moment where Rivera returns to Mexico on fire to create a new art for this new nation. and take viewers through his work in Mexico in the 20s, and then his work in the United States in the early 30s, and then his return to Mexico in the late 30s, and kind of take us through World War II. And these two images give us a sense of this range from the work of the 20s into the work of the 1940s. We have the next slide, and I should say that part of this was determined by the fact that we were developing the show initially for the SF MoMA, and Rivera played an enormous role in San Francisco, both as someone whose work was avidly collected by private individuals and museums from a very early period, and also as a muralist. San Francisco was the first place in the United States that Rivera worked as a mural painter, 1930-31, and he shaped the course of public art in San Francisco, not only during the New Deal, but into the Chicano civil rights movement and even to today. So this was part of the way we wanted to frame the show in San Francisco.
It is really fascinating to me that Rivera is such an important figure in modern art, in the history of Mexican art, in the history of such a broad range. You could say in terms of 20th century art, he's one of the top artists, and one that really has a lot of name recognition too, that people know of Rivera, but that this is the first exhibition in more than 20 years to really take a comprehensive look at his career. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what makes this special compared to previous exhibitions of Rivera's work, and then also if you had any comment on why it has been a bit of a stretch for such a major artist to have this kind of in-depth look.
Well, I think one of the things that's different about this show is its more compressed chronological focus, which really brings together more paintings from this period, 20s, 30s, early 40s, than have been seen in one place since Rivera was alive. There were major retrospectives held in Detroit in 1986, and then in Cleveland in 1999. But by focusing in on a tighter chronological period, I was able to bring into the exhibition works that had never been seen before, juxtapose works that were done at the same time that have never been shown together since they left Rivera's studio, bring together preparatory drawings with paintings. We'll talk about some of these issues as we move along. And as to, I think some people might have said, does Rivera need another exhibition? And I might have even thought that at a certain point because of these major retrospectives that had been held. But I found, as I worked on this as a curator, that even such simple, basic art historical issues as what were the correct titles for paintings had not been really well worked out. And so there was still a lot of fresh work that needed to be done.
One thing that this show really addresses is the relationship between Rivera's work in murals, something that really defined his career and for which he maybe is best known, and the work that he did in oil painting, the work that he did in individual pictures. And we have an example on the screen that shows an oil painting by Rivera along with a mural that has a similar scene. And that throughout the exhibition, you see those moments when you look between his mural work and you look between paintings or drawings or illustrations and have the opportunity to have a more textured or a kind of cross-media look at things. And sometimes it's that the murals come first and he's revisiting an element in a later painting. And sometimes it's a painting that he does and then he later, even decades afterwards, is including it in a mural. So do you want to talk a little bit about that? And then also the challenges of an artist who paints murals and the difficulty of trying to create the experience of that mural for people in a museum gallery.
I have to say that in the organizing of the show from the very beginning, conversations at SF MoMA, this was a big issue that came up. How do we bring the muralist to our audiences when most of the murals can't be moved? Now, in San Francisco, we're very lucky. There's 2 Rivera murals in situ, and there were 2 murals that we could actually move to the museum, one at tremendous technical and economic cost.
Let's just say it could not make the trip to Arkansas. If it can barely make it across the city,
it
was
could barely
not...
make it across the city. It required several night trips by truck just to move one 10-panel work, Pan American Unity, which you'll see discussed in the exhibition. So, but even in San Francisco, how could we bring the Mexican murals to life for our audiences? And so there were several strategies. One is, throughout the show, you'll see mural sketches, and we really paid a lot of attention to Rivera's process as a muralist. So you'll see a lot of drawings. You'll also see on labels an attempt to show specific relationships between easel paintings like the Dance in Tehuantepec on the left and the mural paintings that inspired them. Rivera's collectors in the United States, his major collectors were in the United States in the late 20s and 30s and into the 40s. They knew of Rivera's fame as a muralist, and so in their easel paintings, they wanted works that evoked those murals, that kind of resonated with those murals. And so he used his murals as a sort of source book for easel painting, which he relied on selling to be able to pay for his life and his wife's medical expenses and his children's education, et cetera. But there was something else you asked.
The presentation of the murals
Yes.
in the exhibition through the 3 filmed projections, which are really special because they were created specifically for the exhibition. So we're included in the SF MoMA presentation as well. And then this presentation, these are the only times that these have been shown. So really special to the show and something that was pretty inventive in terms of other exhibitions haven't done this kind of approach. So you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, as a curator of modern Mexican art, I have seen every possible modality of presenting murals in an exhibition space as reproductions in some form. One can put them on a monitor. One can have huge photo blow-ups, et cetera. And none of them were ever really satisfying to me because, to me, they never really communicated the sense of you being there in front of the work of art. Now, there is no substitute for that. I wonder how many of you have been to Mexico City out there? Well, 10, 20%.
Pretty good.
I hope the rest of you get there. If you want to see Rivera's murals, you basically have to go to Mexico City or Detroit to see the best of his works. But so we had a team of filmmakers work, and I kind of became a film director, saying, action and cut. And what I wanted to do was to film still images. You'll see the murals. There's no panning. There's no movement of the camera. Still images of 3 select murals, just to give people a sense of being there with actors doing something, providing a sense of scale and giving some ambient sound. They're playing musical instruments. They're walking. You hear a woman's high heels. You hear chirping birds or music playing off in the background, to give people a sense not only of these things, these murals in their context, but that they are in used spaces today, that they're not in museums, but that they're engaged with by an audience. And I think in SF MoMA, it was moving to see people sit down, kids sit down, and watch these films. They don't have a narrative, there's no story, there's not much action, but they stopped and they looked, and they didn't just walk by. And that, in the end, is, one of the best things a curator can accomplish, I think. So it was really one of my great, points of pride. So I hope you all enjoy that when you go through the show.
I've even just noticed on the few tours that we've done and looking just in the galleries today that people do sit and also take photos, that somebody was taking photo of the projection, that there's something that's really kind of entrancing about it to have it at that kind of scale. So I think that people will have that same kind of experience. If the murals and the paintings and the connection between those are something that we're exploring, you also mentioned the connection between looking at Rivera's work in drawing and how that relates to paintings. And there are many places in the exhibition where you will walk through and see the pairing of a drawing and a painting. And sometimes they're quite close. Sometimes you can see very easily the connection between them. Sometimes you get a sense of Rivera's process in that the composition has changed slightly, or he's given a little bit more detail in one place. But could you talk a little bit about the role of drawings in this, and maybe with the example of the fiesta, something that's interesting there?
Yeah, I think it's something that I think as an art historian, until I was putting together this show, I hadn't really thought that Rivera often worked through the easel paintings through preliminary drawings as he was working through his murals through preliminary drawings. And since we were emphasizing the mural sketches and cartoons so much in the show, it made sense to bring drawings together with paintings. And this is an example. The work on the right, which is coming from Fresno, shows people kind of on an excursion in the south of Mexico City. There's a canal in the background with a boat, and people are buying flowers and wearing these flower crowns. And the drawing on the left is in a private collection, and you can see that they are exactly the same, except they're not at all exactly the same. And you can, when you start to go into a show like this, I tried to bring together objects that really required or asked the viewer, not required, but asked the viewer to compare them, to get a sense of changes, differences, similarities, etc. Again, the rewards that come from close looking. I would have thought, that this had already been done before, that this was all laid out in books before. I mean, Diego Rivera is one of the most famous artists in the world, and not quite as famous as his wife, but you'd think that this basic art history, figuring out the titles or pairing drawings with the paintings, had been done before. This is the foundation of art history, and it hadn't really been done before. So it was something I wanted to draw out in the exhibition.
An intentional pun there. You wanted to draw it out? Sorry. Just that. While we're on that subject of things that are discoveries in the exhibition, or what is it that in that work of art history, tracing the history of a painting or even knowing where a work is can be a big challenge. And could you talk a little bit about the work in the exhibition, The Embroiderer, and something that has a really special kind of story and history about its place in the exhibition?
Yes. So, when we were thinking about what to talk about in a conversation, I think for a curator, the discoveries, the new things are really some of the most exciting. And when I started working on this exhibition, I had access, of course, to all the Rivera literature, and some paintings are very easy to find. We know where they are, and others don't. We don't know where they are. So these are 2 pages, one from a French magazine and a book published in the United States, where you can see this painting of the woman embroidering at an embroidery table. We go back. So this is a woman in Tehuantepec in the south of Mexico. She's sitting in a low chair. She's embroidering a garment similar to the one she wears, just decorated with flowers rather than ribbons. And her daughter, I think, though there's no direct evidence, is watching, a little bit bored. Well, you can't see it because of the subtitles, but you'll see it in the show. So a beautiful picture, but next, only known through these black and white images. And all I had to go on the right side in the book, if you look at the caption, this is what I do for a living. You have to look at that caption like a detective, like some police detective, and it says Private Collection, New Orleans. And so there's a very famous private collection in New Orleans where there are Diego Rivera paintings, and I assumed that it was in that collection and contacted the family. No, we do not have that painting. So I gave it up as lost. And I sent out black and white images to the auction houses and to dealers. No, never seen that painting. So if the show had opened in 2020, as it was scheduled to open, I would have just considered this painting lost. But in one of the benefits of the pandemic, One of the few benefits, I suppose we could say.
More time to do your art historian homework.
More time. Well, we were postponed till the summer of 2022. And in the fall of 2021, one of my colleagues at Christie's, who's here tonight, sent me an email saying, I have very good news. We found a picture has been offered to us, and we're going to be putting it in a sale. There's a confidentiality agreement. I can't tell you what picture it is, but all I can tell you is we found it in New Orleans. And I said, oh, I know what you found. And it was the embroiderer. So very, very fortunately, not only did it come to auction, but it was acquired by the Houston Museum of Fine Arts for their permanent collection. And they very generously loaned it to this exposition before it has even been presented to the public in Houston. So and it was really very, very exciting. And I just want to point out that one of the points to make is, Rivera requires somebody requires the curator to not only know art history, but you have to know anthropology. So to understand exactly what the woman was doing and what the stitching was, I had to take recourse to my colleagues who are in anthropology and studying the history of textiles. Let's see what we have.
I'll note also in the catalog that there's a great description of the painting as well, and goes into more detail about what exactly she's doing, the kind of needlework, and talking about how that maybe differs from the more geometric weepel that she wears. So another plug for the catalog, if you really want to dive deeper into the content, there's some really great detailed looks at the works.
Yeah. And then just think not only about its specificity, but how it relates to other very famous Rivera paintings. So the tortilla maker on the right has been in almost every single Diego Rivera show. And you see how here in the 20s, he's doing two images that are about women working at home with their daughters, I think, watching them. And so that Rivera has this interest in how tradition is passed down through from mother to daughter, and could be stimulate a whole new conversation, I think.
And I'll point out that these two images were of particular interest in the preparation for the exhibition. One of the things that we did at Crystal Bridges was form a small advisory group of people, and I saw at least one of them in the audience today that would offer feedback on things related to the exhibition, especially about programming and a printed guide that would be distributed in the community. So we showed them images from the show, talked about some of the content, and they highlighted especially these two as ones that were really of interest, and talked about themes related to the generational passing down of knowledge, or something that's as relatable as making food with someone in your family, how a scene like that resonates so much, and that there's so much detail within these you can go into to talk about food preparation and how, in this case, it connects to that history of indigenous food making, with even the tools that the women are using in the tortilla maker have names that come from Nahuatl that are the metate or the molcajete or the comal on which they're toasting the tortillas. So it's a simple scene, one that has that kind of sense of invitation for people to have a point of connection, but that there's all this depth around the things that Rivera was interested in. So we created a guide that explores these images in depth, and it'll be distributed as part of our mobile art lab that goes out into the community. And that's one of the different programming things that we have, not only on site here, but within the community, that will be out talking to audiences, generating their interest in Rivera in the show, and really shaped by the feedback that we had from members of the community here. You could talk, I think, a little bit more about, this is one that we highlighted because that sense of a special opportunity to see things on view in public for really the first time. And this is a picture that has a really rich history, so tell us more.
Yeah, of all the works in the show, I had to bring this one up. That the member of the family that owns this picture is here. And tonight, and this is a portrait of Frances Ford Seymour, socialite, and her daughter from Frances de Villers. And This woman, the older woman, is more famous as the wife, by this point in 1941, of Henry Fonda, and therefore the mother of Jane and Peter Fonda. And on one level, this painting was important for me to include. It was, I learned about it through one of the auction houses, put me in contact with the family that still owned it. It's owned it since it was painted in 1941. And on the one hand, it was a picture that, although known from a very grainy black and white illustration, had also never been seen before in any Rivera exhibition. It's a very personal painting, and therefore, not surprisingly, it had never been lent out of the family. But I got in touch with the family and made an argument for including it in the show, because to me, it was a singular work that encapsulated one side of Rivera's practice. There's a lot of work in the show that's very serious, that's about labor, that's about social strife, that's about transforming society. But Rivera also had to earn a living, and he knew how to flatter his subjects. And I think he's taken the mother here and transformed her. She was not herself an actress, even if she was married to a famous actor. He's transformed her into a very alluring star, who captivates us with her look, and with that shirt falling off her shoulder. So it's really interesting when we see in a family photograph of Francis Ford Seymour there on the right with Jane in the center and her half-sister to the left, you see that actually what she wore maybe on a daily basis in the early 40s might have been a little bit more discreet, might have been a little bit more formal.
That's a very gentle way to put it, Jay. I'll say that neckline is about 20 inches delta there.
And so one can see that, was she really wearing that? Or does Rivera paint her face and then invent what she's wearing, which is what portraitists have done for centuries. Many of John Singleton Copley's portraits show women in much more elaborate dresses than they could have ever worn in colonial America. And then the other thing is just for me how he takes this rather straightforward picture and transforms it into the best possible Mexican souvenir that a wealthy person can bring back home by putting mother and daughter in these pink and green skirts that evoke the red and green of the Mexican flag, and then sticking in this impossibly large bouquet of calla lilies after the fact. I'm sure they were not holding those flowers when they were posing for Rivera. So it encapsulates that one side of him. It's a fun, sexy, flattering side. Rivera was somebody who could be in the morning in a serious meeting with peasant organizations arguing for the transformation of society, and in the evening be the best conversationalist at a dinner with the wealthiest people in the world. And he could just move back and forth seamlessly between those two worlds. And so that's what hopefully one gets a sense of in the show through a picture like this. And just in conclusion, I will say that I was very fortunate to be able to take Jane Fonda through the show in San Francisco and talk about this picture and many other things. So. And she
said my mom wore that all the time. No. She affirmed the image on the right-hand side, I am sure.
No, when I asked her if, in fact, why she wasn't in Mexico in 1941, she said, "Oh, my brother and I would have been a drag." So, I guess, anyway.
One of the things that we just wanted to point out, because it's so special in the show to see such a breadth of work by Rivera, and something that sticks out is the variety of frames. And when you look at some of the works, some of them have really special frames. You can just tell that there's something about them, the way that they work with the painting. And we highlighted just two of them here that have the richly painted, the hand-carved surfaces. So tell us a little bit about the frames and also what Rivera was doing with some of these.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges for a curator, we pulled in works of art from over 40 different collections, institutional and private collections. And I don't have a lot of power. Most curators know this. We don't have a lot of power always over the frames that different people might choose. And so frames are a mark of taste, and therefore sometimes those different systems of taste are in collision with each other.
Or they change over time. There was a period when linen lining, a little linen frame within the frame was very popular, and that moment has passed largely.
And so one would think that perhaps Rivera would have wanted very simple proletarian frames. And in some works, particularly the portrait of Francis Ford Seymour, Mrs. Henry Fonda, if you go into the show, you'll see it has a very simple wood strip. And I think that's just what Rivera put on the pictures for transportation. And people that were kind of interested in modern art loved that very simple strip. But in the 20s, we now know, and this kind of emerged from this show, that Rivera was using a very Spanish Baroque style of frame. This is the type of frame with these kind of Baroque, confetti or macaroni in each corner, these volutes and leaves. Very typical of what you would see on a Velázquez, perhaps, or one of the great Spanish masters of the 17th century. So these frames were being produced in workshops in Mexico. And what's interesting is Rivera was having the frame maker coordinate the color in the central areas, coordinate with the paint in the picture, so that there was a sort of a match. And that's one of the ways that we know that not only are they the original, but that they're the original colors. So I think it's quite interesting. I think we brought up this just as a reminder that the show is filled with these juxtapositions of pictures that are related. These are two portraits, a bust and a full-length portrait of a Mexican teacher and intellectual named Aurea Procel, dressed in this high fashion of Tehuantepec that Rivera produced for the market. And these are both in private collections, and they're being shown together in this show for the first time.
We've talked so much about the things that are in the show and having that opportunity to gather things together. And the work on the right is in the show. But when it comes to the work on the left, I was hoping you would talk to us a little bit about when you're putting together an exhibition like that, or like this exhibition, what are some of the things that maybe didn't make it into the show? Or what are the ones that got away?
Yeah, I'd like to think I'm omnipotent, but unfortunately I'm not. And so, I think when I started this show, I identified perhaps a dozen large paintings or major paintings that had been in most of the major Diego Rivera shows from his first exhibition, which was actually held in San Francisco in 1930, his first show as a modern artist. I mean, he'd had smaller shows as a cubist, but and wanted to lock those in place. I think as a curator, I want to get the big skeleton in place, the big armature in place, and then I can fill in the details. And Flower Day on the left from 1925 was the first painting. It's a large painting. It's in the collection of the LA County Museum. It was the first painting by Diego Rivera acquired by an American museum. Already, I think by 1926, I think it was acquired by the museum. It's been on the cover of books on Rivera, and it's really the first major painting that he does on canvas that shows the person selling calla lilies. In this case, it's a woman wearing a long red skirt who's holding another bunch of flowers upside down in her hands. It's an iconic picture, and I know the curators at LA County. The director of SF MoMA knows the director of the LA County Museum. And sometimes pictures are so important to the identity of a museum that they are very, very unwilling to lend. And no matter what I could argue, I could not detach this from their permanent collection, which initially was extremely depressing, but I think that in many aspects of life, and certainly it's true in curating, the bump in the road only forces you to make interesting detours. And so I think when one goes through this exhibition, people don't miss it because I had to bring in other interesting things and tell other interesting stories around it.
Yeah, and that kind of creativity in solving the kind of question of how do you represent something can also be driven by really practical circumstances. So like money would be one to keep in mind, because for any exhibition that brings together works from 40 different collectors and museums, there are those practical things like figuring out the costs of shipping and transporting things, and it can become increasingly complicated when something, say, isn't located in the US but is further afield. And for this exhibition, there are works from across the US, including Hawaii, so not even just continental US. There's a great picture called The Flower Cellar from the Honolulu Museum of Art. And then there's also works from Mexico, a loan from the Tate in England, and then also from Argentina.
Canada.
And so there really is the kind of global map of, if you looked at where these paintings are coming from, it's quite spread out. But in some cases, there just is a little too much. At some point, you have to put a limit on things. So tell us a little bit about the work that on the left is not in the exhibition. It is in Japan, I will assume, still, unless it's gone somewhere else.
Still there. Yeah.
And then the work on the right.
So, we had, I was very, very fortunate, particularly starting an exhibition of this scale before the pandemic. The world seemed to be different and more optimistic about budgets, to have a really healthy budget for loans. And I think, the museum put their faith in me. And if I said it was really important to get, then they kind of said, well, then we're going to try to get it. But at a certain point, you start to hear some feedback that the loan of something is really going to be prohibitively expensive. So one of the things that I wanted to represent in the show was one single work of art from a very important project that Rivera did in New York City in 1933 after his unfortunate experience at Rockefeller Center, where his famous mural there was censored. Rivera took the money and he used it to paint a history of the United States. He called it Portrait of America, for a left-wing school in Manhattan. And 21 different panels. These are 2 panels from that history, a history that, as you can see, concludes with a triumphant view of Marxism or communism. I needed one panel from that series, and unfortunately, 13 of the 21 panels had been destroyed by fire. 8 panels had been distributed around the world. 5 of them were in Mexico, but were inextricable from a teachers' union collection that I won't even go into the bureaucratic details of trying to deal with that. And one was in Lund, Sweden. These had been all distributed after this school closed. Everything, ended up getting sold and distributed around the world. One was in Lund, Sweden. This required it to be taken by boat from Lund to like a train station, and then across the train to a ferry, to another boat, to a plane, and that was like impossible. And so the case too with this other one that ended up in Japan, of all places, in a museum that's dedicated to Mexican art, of all things. So it was actually, this painting on the left was in the first show I ever organized back in 1993 when it was in New York and easy to borrow. And I was very frustrated because the only remaining panel, this small one on the right, was held by a private collector in New York who never lent. So I was really stymied until I found out that that private collector had sold his work to the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art in Los Angeles. And boom, we were able to borrow it because The Lucas Museum has taken a little more time than they planned to open, so they don't need it for their inaugural exhibition. So it's here in our show with another wonderful painting. He actually has 2 great paintings in the show.
I think it's so good to hear about how just the individual histories of paintings can affect even whether they're on view in the exhibition. And wanted to talk a little bit about this wonderful painting that's part of the collection of art bridges, and a painting that actually had an important impact even in Crystal Bridges becoming a venue for the show.
Right. So this picture, The Offering of 1931, is again, it's one of the paintings I would call one of the trophies that the curator wants to secure. It's one of Rivera's largest easel paintings, one of the ones that was most widely reproduced, and one of the most interesting of his paintings, which I'll talk about in a little bit, the subject matter, this Day of the Dead scene. This painting had been originally purchased by Abby Aldrich Rockefeller in New York, who is one of Rivera's most important patrons, and of course her son Nelson, and was really behind bringing Rivera to Rockefeller Center to do that mural. The Rockefellers owned many pictures in the show, including an image of Red Square to show that they weren't afraid of communism. There's a painting of Red Square that was owned by the Rockefellers as well. So when I was kind of sending out feelers to see where these major pictures were, it became quickly evident that this was at Art Bridges and had just been acquired, really. And we reached out to Art Bridges as a loan, to request the loan. And that museum to foundation communication filtered through to the museum here and opened the door to a conversation between Crystal Bridges and SF MoMA to create a partnership. The 2 institutions co-organized the exhibition, which means they shared the costs of a very expensive exhibition. So the fortuitous thing that Art Bridges is opening to Mexican art, these Mexican artists who worked in the United States. There's a great Tamayo on display in the galleries. Also made us think that, sending it to a museum, sending this show, which is about Rivera's America, to a museum of American art would really be an exciting thing. As many institutions are playing with this idea of what America means. And that's what this show is really all about.
And we're really fortunate to have the loan of the work to Crystal Bridges when the exhibition closes. So after the exhibition closes on July 31st, the work will be installed in the Crystal Bridges permanent collection galleries. And it's all part of Art Bridges' mission to share these outstanding works of American art with institutions across the country. So not just Crystal Bridges, but they have loaned this work to other places, or they loan many works from their collection to institutions across the U.S. So very excited to have it for an extended period of time here at Crystal Bridges.
So, I could talk an hour about any of these pictures, but I just wanted to show it in juxtaposition with 2 other works. One is that the painting does relate to Rivera's murals. He did 3 murals on the theme of the Day of the Dead for his famous cycle in the Ministry of Education in Mexico City, and this is one of them. And if you look in the lower corner of the Art Bridges painting, you can see a little garland of marigolds, and marigolds are something very frequently used in Day of the Dead celebrations. They're all over the panel on the right. So the painting, like many other Rivera works, does relate to the murals, but at the same time, it's very different. And it's very different from other images of the Day of the Dead, which is celebrated at the beginning of November in Mexico, that Rivera did, including this later painting on the right, where you see a group of indigenous people traditionally dressed in a cemetery with candles burning, incense burners, etc. Something we would really expect to see. And one of the reasons I wanted to end the discussion of Rivera with this image is that, a curator does a project like this. I did a catalog, I invited all the scholars, I've given teen tours, and Maria Castro, who I worked with on the show, who's here from SF MoMA, gave even more tours than I did, because she's based at the museum. You think you do everything, or you want to think you know everything, and that there's still stories that need to be unpacked or figured out. And I still don't understand why Rivera has placed these 3 children with their tiny little Day of the Dead altar in a strange garden. It's not a natural landscape. These plants in the garden, the cactus, the elephant ear, don't all exist in the same natural space, so it's got to be a garden. Is it Rivera's house garden? It's painted in 1931 when he's going back and forth between the United States and Mexico. Did Abby Aldrich Rockefeller ask for a painting about the Day of the Dead? What are some of the stories behind this picture? What, in fact, is that boy carrying on the left? Is it a sugar skull, such as are sold during the Day of the Dead, or is it some bundle? What's the story behind this picture? Who are these kids? Why are they in a garden? These are questions that I wasn't able to answer in this show, and hopefully a project like this, ends up pushing forth new scholarship as well as, closing a door.
And I'll say that doing a staff preview with folks, many of whom work on the Trails and Grounds team, there were many Trails and Grounds team members that commented that they were really interested in vegetation and different plants throughout works in the show, and that this was one especially that's really interesting. And I think that the exciting thing about having a show that has so many different ways to enter into the subject matter is that we'll probably get really amazing feedback and insights from people who have specializations in very different areas.
I didn't bring a slide, but for those of you who are art historians, probably looking at the work of Henri Rousseau or Paul Gauguin, which 2 artists that Rivera was deeply interested in, would help lead us at least some way down the path. And I didn't even think of that when we were setting up this PowerPoint, but I think one of the interesting areas of scholarship, and what I'm working on in a book now, is to open up Rivera beyond Mexico and look at the artists like Giotto and Picasso, Cezanne, Rousseau, who he was deeply interested in and who shaped his work. He's a Mexican artist, but he doesn't operate in a Mexican vacuum. So I could have made that point too, but I'll have to save that for another lecture.
All right, so to end this lecture, I've heard Diego Rivera's America, and yet there are some works by another artist in the show. So can you tell me about what 3 works by the artist Frida Kahlo are doing in the exhibition, and especially the work in which she includes a self-portrait of herself next to Rivera?
Well, as you organize an exhibition, there are certain things that emerge, and one of them, in the case of SF MoMA, was that the museum collection included the most famous portrait of Diego Rivera, done in this case by Frida. And this painting, like the flower carrier, which is also on view here from the SF MoMA permanent collection, is really one of the great icons of the collection. So it seemed to be important to figure out a way to include it in the show. I think if it had been in another museum collection, I wouldn't have tried to borrow it for the show. But since it was in our home institution, not my home institution, but the home institution, I wanted to figure that out. And so it really emerged, and Maria, who's here, worked on this for the catalog, emerged that we would maybe try to explore in an essay and in the exhibition that Rivera's presence in San Francisco was part of a broader network. He came with Kahlo. Together, they made very close and important, had very close and important friendships. There's a portrait by Kahlo of one of Rivera's assistants here in the exhibition. There's a portrait of her doctor, who is also a very close friend of Rivera. And in the portrait by Frida Kahlo of the doctor, you look closely, you'll see on the wall of the room he's in, is a drawing by Diego Rivera that Frida Kahlo has painted into her own picture. So that these paintings were really about a dialogue between these 2 artists in California. that were a part of a broader network that Rivera established in the United States that led to his assistants going on to be muralists and that shaped the course of art in the United States. So that was really how we incorporated that into a gallery that at SF MoMA was really richly about Rivera's fundamental importance in the city of San Francisco, and that we, I think, communicate here as well. But the other thing I'll mention is that we had, fortunately, at SF MoMA, this monumental, huge 10-panel fresco called Pan American Unity that Rivera had painted for a World's Fair in San Francisco that year, and we were able to move it to SF MoMA. And so in basically one of the entrance lobbies of the museum, we had this enormous mural, and in that enormous mural is a very famous portrait by Diego Rivera of Frida Kahlo. So at SF MoMA, the painting on the left, in a way, was in dialogue with the detail on the right, in which you see Kahlo in this extraordinary Tijuana costume now as the painter. If you look at the painting, you see that Kahlo shows herself as a very beautifully dressed and very nationalistically dressed accessory to the larger male artist wearing international overalls. But in the painting, Rivera flips that. He's sort of distracted by this attraction to Paulette Goddard, the actress.
He's the figure with his back to you, so he's behind Rivera, looking at the little tree? Question mark.
It's a tree of energy, generating energy force. We'll just leave it at that. Well, for Rivera, Rivera pairs himself here with the American movie star in a kind of a gesture of Pan-American unity between. Okay, I'm not going any further with this audience. But what I will say is this. What I wanted to just say is this: is that the relationship between the two was. It's extremely complicated, but one can see how Rivera knew about the painting on the left. And when Rivera is painting that mural in San Francisco, he knows the Kahlo is hanging in the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco. It's one of the only Kahlos on public display in the United States at that time. And I would argue that in some way, his mural is, at a time of divorce between the two, is sort of responding to her painting. And now he pulls himself more into the background and pushes her into the foreground as the embodiment of the great Mexican artist, which is why she holds a palette and brushes and stands before a blank canvas. So there's a fascinating dialogue here. I think the show, as you go through it, there are a lot of hidden dialogues in the show. There's a lot of correspondences and juxtapositions that I worked very hard to put together, and I think Jen did a masterful job of translating from the specific gallery spaces in San Francisco to the spaces here at Crystal Bridges. And I hope you all can find some of those stories, not only in the labels, but through your own readings of the show. So I think with that, I'll say thank you and let it.
Well, thank you so much. I am flipping to a slide here that has a QR code that you have the ability to scan the QR code and then type a question, and then the question will magically transmit to a tablet that I have. So if everything works as said, and I see magically something is already appearing. So we'll keep the question and answer time not too long, because I know that there are some things later this evening. Maybe we'll have 3 questions, and I'll go ahead and start with one. This is James. Considering present-day artists, who do you feel are continuing the artistic legacy of Diego Rivera? And then the next hour will be Jay's response to that question,
because that's a very, very difficult question. Obviously, there are many muralists who are working across the United States today, community muralists in big cities, but also in rural areas, who, though their imagery, and I can't even mention names, but although their imagery might have nothing to do with Rivera, might have nothing to do with Mexico or to any of the issues that were important to Rivera, the very idea of an engaged mural practice of bringing art to broad audiences is deeply indebted to him. So, as well as to other Mexican muralists. So that's one thing. But I would also say, just as something that I teach, so it's at the top of my mind, an artist like Padgett whose equestrian monument, which title has just gone off my head, but somebody's going to know it, in Richmond, Virginia. Yes, Rumors of War, thank you. Where, he did an equestrian monument of an average African-American guy, just street clothes, on horseback, in bronze, to situate it in Richmond in dialogue with the other monuments that have now been taken down on Monument Avenue there. Somebody like that, and the patrons behind a monument like that, are people who believe that art can change perceptions, can change society, can actually, transform things for the better. And so even though one wouldn't necessarily link Padgett with Diego Rivera in terms of a direct art historical connection, that belief in the power of art to change things is definitely, I think, one can see the legacy of artists like Rivera in that.
Absolutely. Second question. If you could classify Diego into a signature style, is it portrait, murals, historical, or question mark? I think that person might be thinking, what is it that you would say, if you had to sum it up, his style that defines the work?
I think, if we talk about style in terms of art historical categories, one would probably try to fit Rivera into something like social realism, or what was in France after World War I called the return to order, which meant a departure, a rejection of fragmentation, of abstraction, for a figuration that was grounded in the daily life of the working class, and particularly of people in the countryside. And we'll see that all over the world in the 1920s and 30s. In some places that are very close to our hearts, like Thomas Hart Benton, for example. Other places, Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, will see that same desire for a type of figuration that will tell a story of national identity. But I think, for Rivera, that figurative style, that social realism, was tied to a very progressive view of the world. That, again, as I said before, that art was going to make things better for as many people as possible. And I think, that's something that we have to really hold on to. Figuration was questioned in the post-war period by many artists as too didactic and even too corny calendar art, But when you go through a show like this, I have to say, I feel, I love Mondrian as much as anyone, but nobody cries in front of a Mondrian. And people do cry and get emotional in front of a Diego Rivera. And they see in the Rivera their grandmother, or they see in Rivera a memory of the past, or they see in Rivera a world that they left behind. And that is extremely powerful, I think, which is not to say, anything against abstraction. But that I think is something important to keep in mind.
Yeah, that style, when you think about that moment when the figurative style seemed like it was, less in fashion, and then within our present moment, the very complex kind of relationship to figurative work becoming even more notable again. And the sense in which Rivera's work has a very contemporary feel in some ways. That somebody commented in the galleries yesterday that feels like it could have been painted recently. And it's that kind of interesting crossover between something that feels almost classical, like that still feels like it has such a kind of harkening back to art history or to older forms of making, but then also feels very fresh and new is really special.
People still love storytelling, and Rivera is a great storyteller, and that's one thing that makes his work so relatable.
Absolutely. So we have one more question that we're going to answer, just because we want to make sure we don't run too far over, a little over an hour. But this question is, given the different worlds Rivera lived in, from advocating for the working class to mixing and earning a living from the wealthy, he was obviously very adept at that. But did he feel a tension or ever have clashes in those domains?
Yeah, sometimes a question really comes at something from an angle that maybe the curator or historian hasn't really thought about. But
and if that were to happen when that curator was on a stage, then it might.
but Rivera was a very, very chatty artist. He had numerous long interviews with journalists, and these were compiled into several books. He never himself wrote an autobiography, but there are many biographical works on Rivera that are based on interviews with him. And in those sources, he doesn't talk about some sort of a stress or tension between these two worlds. He was criticized by the left for working with capitalists, for taking commissions from people like Rockefeller or Ford, whose politics were often, questionable, especially to members of the Communist Party in Mexico. But I think one thing that's revelatory is something that came up in the project. Again, something that I think Maria drew to attention in her catalog essay. And that is when Rivera painted a mural for the Luncheon Club at the Pacific Stock Exchange in San Francisco. And that mural, Allegory of California, is one of the 3 projections in the gallery. You get this wonderfully, fertile
image of California, who's surrounded by the bounty of nature and technology. And Rivera was criticized, and people said, why? Look, he's just painted this very pro-capitalist image for the capitalists, right? And Rivera's response, and I'm really paraphrasing, was, no, I'm reminding them that the bounty of the stockbrokers and the bankers here at the stock exchange doesn't come from their speculative work, but from the labor that transforms the wealth of California, the natural wealth of California, into capital. And he wanted to remind them of that, of the importance of labor. And I think even in the paintings that are being collected by wealthy people in the 1930s or 40s, I think that's what Rivera saw. He saw each and every one of these pictures, sure, not the society portraits, but he was a man and a husband and a father who had to make a living, and he couldn't live in the utopia that he dreamed of, right? He had to live in the real world. But in many of his pictures, these pictures of these working class people that we started the conversation talking about, like the women making tortillas, I think he saw them as sort of catalysts that would be hanging on the wall, reminding people on a daily basis of who's important, who matters, who should be in art, and what the values of a society should be. And so I think in that way, even the paintings he was producing for the market had a political intent.
Well, Thank you so much, Jay, for this conversation. And thank you, everyone, again, for being here tonight. We hope that you have lots of time in the galleries throughout the next weeks and months to spend time with these really remarkable works, to bring your own perspectives and ideas to them, and also come back for more of the programming that we have. So, everyone, enjoy the exhibition, and thank you again for coming.
Thank you.